Welcome to episode 11 of Inside the Actor Studio, or whatever this show's called. In my last episode, I mentioned Daniil Kharms, or Daniil Kharms, I've heard it pronounced, or Daniil Kharms. Just how you spell it. Hold that up longer. I'm not an actual host, and this is not an actual show. And I doubt anyone will watch this, except my grandchildren. But one of the sort of a thought experiment to do when it comes to just how fiction works is to comes from, I'll just say Daniil Kharms. Just even if it's a mispronunciation, I'll just stay consistent on that one. But he named himself after Sherlock Holmes. The Kharms, he's Russian, so, through some sort of translation, Holmes and Kharms somehow sound similar. I'm going to talk about mystery, and my little black cat, Spike, is in the doorway, meowing. But he named himself after Sherlock Holmes, and superficially, Daniil Kharms and Arthur Conan Doyle don't seem to have a lot in common. There you go. Don't seem to have a lot in common. That's better. My voice is still struggling from yesterday. They don't seem to have a lot in common. So it's interesting to contemplate what they do actually have in common. A lot of times when people make rules about how fiction works, from the perspective of a writer, when people make rules about how fiction works, they tend to make them really particularly about the type of fiction they like, or a small range. So a lot of the times you'll see, here's what all writers should do, and it's very narrowly dedicated to literary fiction, which is not a great term to begin with, or it's really narrowly dedicated to realism, and this is something that I've encountered a lot. If you make rules for how fiction works, and it only works with realism, I'm drinking morning coffee in my rainbow cup, of course. But if you make rules for how realism works, it creates this hierarchy, and this is sort of the process that I recognize going on anytime that's in classes, of course, in textbooks, of course. I'm still seeking after somebody who has a good idea, who has a good list of, or who has a good set of rules or explanations. Breaking them down to rules is a bad idea to begin with, but I'm still, still haven't found what I'm looking for, to paraphrase you two. But really, and the few people who have given me feedback on my system say it works for imaginary fiction or experimental fiction, but it doesn't work for anything else, which is just not true. I wouldn't want to create a system that only worked for experimental fiction like Daniil Kharms. I would want something that works for what I would call schematic fiction, what other people would call, or highly schematic fiction, or what other people might call genre fiction, which is another terrible term. Genre just implies some sort of insult. Here's Spike, my little black cat, for my discussion of mystery. I'm not going too in depth about mystery, but it's a rainy day, black cat. Tuxedo cat. So, coming up with some sort of system that only works for experimental fiction, it's not a very effective system except for a very narrow amount of people. So I want to make sure that any sort of system I come up with, like my rainbow circle, I could put it on my lap this time. Here's half of it, or one third of it. Systems like that should be able to work for Daniil Kharms and for Arthur Conan Doyle, which it does. I want to make sure that's clear. And Daniil Kharms is one of the more experimental and strange and absurd writers. Arthur Conan Doyle is highly schematic, and I've talked about that before. But if you're just joining us in my imaginary scenario where I have new viewers all of a sudden, maybe I get another grandchild. I don't know. This is for my grandchildren. Maybe one has just been born before. What do you think? Between episode 11 and episode 12. Did I say episode? This is episode 12. Between episode 11 and episode 12, I have another grandchild. Who knows? But maybe you do. Maybe you do. Maybe you do. Oh, I lost my place. But schematic, I think, is a better way of understanding story structure. Okay, be still. Be still. I have a bunch of superhero stickers in my Daniil Kharms book. And today I wrote nothing. In this Daniil Kharms book. Be still. Be still. But what was I saying? This happens with these animals, these darn animals. I lose track of what I'm saying. Okay, events. So, the way the schematic works, be still, baby. The way the schematic works is an internal organizing system. So, that could be a genre, or that could be any other number of internal organizing systems. So I talked about this with my class the other day, and I just to give an example, I said name a genre, and one person said sci-fi, which is it's a tricky thing to do, because if you're talking about the schema of sci-fi, you're actually talking about dozens and dozens of different schema. It's supposedly it's a genre, implying that it's generic, but it's one of the least generic genres because there are hundreds of subgenres. So if you said what is a sci-fi story, are there alien invasions or future technology, or what is the beginning, middle, and end of that story? But the example somebody else brought up is romance, and romance is highly schematic because there tends to be a set of elements that are always in romance, almost always in romance. The meet cute, which is a term I hate, but meet cute. There's a couple. Traditionally, it's boy meets girl. I know for sure that these days it's not just boy and girl, but the classic traditional one is boy meets girl, boy loses girl, or whatever, or girl loses boy. But whatever gender the couple is, whatever gender the couple is, and they meet, they have this awkward meeting, there's a misunderstanding, maybe there's a love triangle, there's another person involved, love square or whatever, and there's some sort of chase, and very, very frequently in movies it's a run to the airport. Somebody's running to the airport. And it, becomes cliche. But it's schematic in the sense that you can have all of those elements in a romantic story, but the individual elements, if you give them enough vitality, it doesn't matter that you have these expected elements. And so the couple ends up together in the end, and it's a happily ever after. So part of the function of the schema is that, this is level 3, now that the cat's gone, this is level 3, visceral, paradoxical, schematic. A schematic, it's increasing levels of comfort, as I mentioned last time. The center is pure stimulation, the outer rim is moving towards destimulation or moving towards comfort. So schematic elements can be comforting. So in a romance story, you know, it's comforting to see these schematic elements. Comforting to see these schematic elements show up. But it's a good romance when the individual elements are dynamic. So it's not a matter of those elements being unoriginal and being a flaw in the story. For people who enjoy that type of story, repeated elements is not a flaw, it's just a component, that's it. And that's a big problem with a lot of concepts of story structure being really limited to realism or literary fiction or, you know, things like that. That is as much a preference of the writer as, you know, somebody writing rules for romance stories or what have you, romance novels or romance movies. So one of the most schematic is mystery. So if you talk about Arthur Conan Doyle, if you read a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle or Agatha Christie, I think it was last winter and spring, I binged as much Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie. Must have been last summer and fall. I binged as much Agatha Christie and Arthur Conan Doyle as I could, because I was editing a mystery novel called The Upholstery Man, forthcoming from Thurston Howell. But part of my reason for getting into writing mystery novels, I've written 14 novels, and 3 of them are mystery novels. Most of the novels I've written are not schematic. I've mentioned The Living Needle is very non-linear. Most of them are magical realist, if you want to use a schematic term. But I wrote three mystery novels. But part of it is comes from this fascination with the schema, and wanting to experiment. I know I'm saying it's an experiment, but it's the least experimental thing to do. But experimenting with highly restrictive structures was interesting, for sure. Enjoyable, definitely. But if you're coming up with a system, or any sort of rule system, then it should work for Daniil Kharms as well as it works for Arthur Conan Doyle. So it should work for the more nonlinear experimental work that, you know, like the collage comic that I mentioned last video. I mentioned a couple of thousand things last video, so I don't know if anything comes coherently from episode 11. One of the things I talked about was Max Ernst's collages, and oh, Boots is visiting. Boots is never around. He just hides away, but he's coming to visit today. He might get in my lap, I don't know. Boots, might get in my lap. Oh, Maggie scared him away. Maggie, not on purpose. Maggie, Boots was coming to visit. And now Siku, of course, is back. Okay, everybody calm down. Everybody calm down. What's the matter, Siku? What's the matter? This is why my last video was so scattered. I'll just blame the dogs at least. I'll blame the dogs. Because you guys were going crazy last video. I couldn't stay on topic. I'm going to stay on topic this video. I'm going to stay on topic. Okay, sit still. Okay, so Daniil Kharms, if you're not familiar with Daniil Kharms, just a good example, and I think this is an interesting example to compare directly with the schema of mystery, because it's about people dying. Hey baby, be still. It's about people dying. I'll read just a little bit of it and just show you. And it's similar to the absurd accumulation of Ionesco. I mean, it clearly reminds me of Ionesco. There's an Ionesco play called The Killing Game. Okay. There's an Ionesco play called The Killing Game that works with a similar sort of structure. There are not a whole lot of stories that have a similar structure as this one. One day Orlef stuffed himself with mashed peas and died. I'm going to mispronounce these, I'm afraid. I won't go too far, so I don't have to mispronounce it too much. Krylov, having heard the news, also died. And Spiridonov, maybe it's how you pronounce that, died regardless. And Spiridonov's, Spiridonov? However you pronounce that, fell from the cupboard and also died. And their children drowned in a pond. Their grandmother took to the bottle and wandered the highways. Mikhailov stopped combing his hair and came down with the mange. It's actually really short. Let me just read the rest. And Kruglov sketched a lady holding a whip and went mad. And something received 400 rubles wired of the telegram and was so uppity about it that he was forced to leave his job. All good people, but they don't know how to hold their ground. So it's the absurd accumulation like the UNESCO, because there's no explanation. There's a little brief explanation of the connection between these. There's no explanation of vague explanation of cause. The cause and effect is mostly missing. But it functions essentially the same way. I mean, if at the core it functions as the same as a mystery novel, in the sense that you have the empathetic experience of the fear of death. It's a powerful sort of visceral image. This person kind of just died from mashed peas. And so there is an automatic counter-response to that you want to make sure, you have this empathetic experience with a character who then just dies. And so the sense of dread comes from the need to resolve the danger of the particular story. And so you have two people dying for a reason, and then a character just dying randomly. So with the accumulation of these deaths, you have with the accumulation of these deaths, you have a somewhat explainable, kind of, sort of, you ate mashed potatoes and died. It's kind of explainable. You have a kind of explainable death, which gives you a very sort of a minimal bump of dread of death. If you just say that sentence alone, you said so and so died from eating mashed potatoes and peas. There's a bit of dread there. It's kind of funny too, because it's kind of a ridiculous way of dying. And there's a guilty sort of humor to that. It's funny, but it's not funny at the same time. And then you have somebody else dying as a consequence of that directly, and then somebody dying regardless. So you're seeking after some sort of connection and rationale and explanation for that, but as they pile on, the more the dread just accumulates. And so the reader is seeking after some sort of connection or explanation of why these deaths are occurring, and in order to, and that's the push and pull of the two ends of the spectrum. So you have this empathetic experience of dread of death here, and then this side is pulling it towards some sort of rationale. So it's constantly pulling this direction and saying, why is this happening? What is the connection? And then Daniil Kharms, and he does this with a lot of stories, but Daniil Kharms is just sort of cutting that off constantly. Your need for explanation, he's just cutting it off at the cutting it off at the root, before it can even develop into any sort of explanation. So these first two are connected, and this third one is random, and these other people are random. It's a very tiny thing, but it's actually really complicated. It's a perfect example of story structure without any sort of traditional markers of story structure. And then by the end, it gets to a moral. All good people, but they don't know how to hold their ground, which doesn't make any sense. It's almost a satire of a moral. And the story right after that, I think, is it's structured in a similar way. It's called Tumbling Old Women. In Today I Wrote Nothing. It's called, this is, Today I Wrote Nothing is a collection of a lot of different books. This is from Incidents. The book is called, anyway, it's just from a book called Today I Wrote Nothing. But Tumbling Old Women has a similar sort of structure, but it gives another clue about, how this kind of story structure works by the end. Because of her excessive curiosity, one old woman tumbled out of her window, fell and shattered to pieces. Another old woman leaned out to look at the one who'd shattered, but of excessive curiosity, also tumbled out of her window, fell and shattered to pieces. Then a third and a fourth and fifth. And then when the sixth old woman tumbled out of the window, I got sick of watching and walked over to Maltsev, I guess, market, where they say a blind man had been given a knit shawl. And that's the whole story. So, you have the absurd accumulation, like Ionesco, where it's this random death followed by this other causally related random death, semi-random death, and then a third one, and by the time you get to the sixth one, that's when the viewer just gets tired of the exact same thing, which I talked about before. The ability to feel the visceral impact or the empathetic experience with it becomes deadened. So in a longer piece, you would add on to that, and Ionesco does that. Absurd accumulation tends to ramp it up. Those two are very, very short, and they don't really ramp it up at all. They just sort of repeat the same sort of gimmick. But Ionesco just adds more and more and more of whatever until they end, and then shuts it off. But that's, you can look at those two stories for a really essential mechanism of how stories work, and that's something that I did just before I ever read Daniil Kharms. Actually, it was right before I read Daniil Kharms. I was working in a bookstore. Working in a bookstore 20 years ago when I discovered Daniil Kharms. And Vidensky. They were published in a book together. But that's something I did while I was working there, is I just broke stories down to what is the most basic element. And, person standing alone, standing still, is that a story? Does that have visceral impact? A leaf falling off a tree. What causes that to have, any sort of visceral impact? How do I then turn that into a story? So I did a lot of experiments like that, and then I discovered that Kharms is doing the same thing. So, you might think that's highly irrational. Daniil Kharms stories tend to be highly irrational. How are they doing the same thing that Sherlock Holmes is doing? And Sherlock Holmes stories tend to be super rational. And we view them as super rational because of the main character. The main character is super rational. Sherlock Holmes. And Watson, to a degree. He's super rational, and that's kind of one of his defining traits. And there's all kinds of things you could say about Sherlock Holmes as a character, too. Because one of my fascinations with mystery is that it's this idea of how if you can retain stimulation through multiple readings, essentially, is the idea. So if you have a mystery, where does the stimulation come from? The uncertainty of who the murderer is, or something like that. There's this menace of a murderer. Let's say it's a murder mystery. There are other kinds of mysteries. Let's say it's a murder mystery. There's this menace, this unresolved menace of who a murderer is. And once you've actually figured that out and you reread it, will it retain the stimulation even though you know who the murderer is? And with Sherlock Holmes, with Arthur Conan Doyle stories, it retains stimulation because Sherlock Holmes as a character is so compelling and fascinating. And it goes back to what I was talking about before, where he's such a Superman type of character in so many ways, and Watson is very reverent to his superhuman abilities, but he's also such a broken man, such a troubled man. A lot of that has to do with reinterpretations over different decades, of course. Of course, these days we diagnose him with whatever, mental issue he's dealing with. But at the time, he was still broken and complicated, and socially, I wouldn't say socially inept, but socially disinterested in the niceties of society and that sort of thing. And he does cocaine, and he has all kinds of other complicated issues that are hints of his brokenness that he's compensating for because he's such a great genius at this particular thing that he does. He struggles on other levels, and other detectives have followed with that kind of thing. And when you read Agatha Christie, that's Poirot is a really interesting character. Miss Marple is a really interesting character. If you read enough Agatha Christie, Miss Marple really seems like the biggest psychopath in the whole village. I love Miss Marple, but I'm just saying, over time, you read enough Miss Marple stories, she comes off as a crazy person. But I love her. That's for another day, I'm sure. But if you look at a standard Sherlock Holmes story and you said, what is the source of the stimulation of a standard Sherlock Holmes story? Like Silver Blaze, one of the famous ones. And Silver Blaze is, this is just by pure coincidence. Silver Blaze is where you get the title of The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, the book The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime. And the kid in that book is autistic. And the mystery novel that I wrote 3 there, and the main character, his name's Bird'n'Eye Parnassus, but which came from a dream. We can talk about dreams later, but he's 12 and he has markers. I wouldn't specifically identify it as autistic, but you could read it as autistic, and a lot of people, say, is Sherlock Holmes autistic and that sort of thing. And I wouldn't directly identify it as autistic, but it was based on how much I loved Sherlock Holmes stories and Agatha Christie stories, and I'm riffing on a lot of that kind of stuff. He's not specifically, it's set in the 80s, so, I don't know that he would have been diagnosed at that time. But there are markers. I didn't want to really narrow it down to a specific condition that he had, what part of the spectrum he's on. I didn't want to identify that. Whereas Mark Haddon very directly identifies the main character in Curious Incident, all the different markers and that sort of thing. And just writing the book, I realized I hadn't read Curious Incident as I was writing the book, but as I was writing the book, I realized this might come off as somewhat similar, and so I made sure to read Curious Incident at that point, just to make sure they're different. Their actual story is different, but I'm afraid that I run across that sometimes where I accidentally do something similar to somebody else, and I want to make sure to distance it as much as possible. What do you think, Maggie? You were growling at something. What were you growling at? Probably a dog walking down the street. So, getting off track. I was trying not to get off track like I did so much yesterday. But if you look at something like Silver Blaze, which has always been one of my favorites, regardless of whether or not it shows up in another book that has vague, minor, coincidental similarities to another book. But something like that, you have, a dead body who actually killed the person. And And so Sherlock Holmes goes around from suspect to suspect, and so the structure of the story is you do have this menace who's could still be at large. It could be this criminal organization that's this criminal organization manipulating horse racing to make money on the gambling or what have you, or it could be this other thing, or it could be this other thing. And so Sherlock Holmes is essentially functioning, even though he himself as a character is really complicated. He's functioning based on the Rainbow Circle. Here's the death right here, the menace of the murderer, right at the center. Sherlock Holmes is functioning around here, around the perimeter, as someone actively striving to eliminate the menace of death by eliminating whoever the murderer is, or eliminating the criminal, whatever kind of criminal it is. And a lot of stories aren't murder. I mean, there's a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories are about theft of a diamond or something like that, or international intrigue or whatever. But there's always some sort of menace. And so Sherlock Holmes is functioning to eliminate that menace. So it ramps it up. I mean, the Silver Blaze is a short one, but if you look at longer ones, like Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sign of the Four. Sign of the Four kind of functions a little differently. Studying the Scarlet. Any of it ramps up it ramps up the menace as it goes throughout the story, because it'll add another element that seems to give hints about who the possible murderer might be. That may pan out, or that may be a dead end, and then you seem to get closer, but then it adds on another mysterious element. And so there's all kinds of complexity to the actual structure, but the ultimate goal is still the same, is enhancing the menace of the murderer who's still at large. And so by the time you get to the end, Sherlock Holmes is the mechanism for releasing that tension. And at the end, I mean, there's a lot you can say about a climax of any sort of story, but I think that's the area where most people make the biggest mistake about how stories work, is looking at the climax of a story. Because a lot of people will, in being caught up in that basic structure of having this murderous menace on the loose, and having a feeling deep inside that I want this menace to be extinguished. I almost accidentally slipped into quotes from Samuel Bacon's Endgame, but I will not go off track, I swear. But you have this desire for the menace of the murderer to be extinguished, that once it is extinguished, in that climactic scene, because it's ramped up so much, because he's adding more and more clues, and you get closer and closer to figuring out who it is. And Silver Blaze is really expertly structured so that he does give you the elements that go into the climax, but no matter how smart you are, if you're unfamiliar with the story, no matter how smart you are, I'm going to spoil it in a second if you are, no matter how smart you are, you're not really going to guess it more than likely. I wonder how many people actually guess it, or if anybody actually pretends that they've guessed the ending of the story. But the best Sherlock Holmes stories are ones like that. Some of the stories will be just some element you haven't heard before, but so the actual mystery part of it is not as well structured as something like Silver Blaze or some of the best ones. But once you get to the end and you get to the climax, there's a brief burst of stimulation, and then it drops off because the actual source of the tension has been released. So the mistake that people make about the ending of a story, in comparison to a Daniil Kharms story that doesn't really have an ending, has some sort of fake endings, arguably. Once you get to the end with that brief burst of stimulation and the drop off and the release of the tension, the mistake people make is to call that the purpose of the story. So Sherlock Holmes is this hyper-rational character, and hyper-rationality wins the day at the end of the story. And so people will say, the point of the story is that rationality always wins. If that's the point of the story, that there's a very, very limited amount of stories that can actually apply to. It takes all stories ever, narrows it down to a very, very small number of stories where rationality actually always wins in a very narrow amount of stories. Sherlock Holmes stories, and what else? What other stories ever does rationality win the day? Whereas if you recognize the visceral impact of the menace of the looming murderer mystery out there, something uncertain that's menacing the audience, and the way that the structure of the story functions to enhance that mystery, that's something that you could take that element of it and you can apply it to Daniil Kharms. Whereas saying that the function of a mystery story is to prove that rationality always wins the day, that doesn't apply to every story. You can't take that and apply it to Daniil Kharms. Unless you just really forced it. And there's plenty of times when people just they have some sort of idea of how all stories should be. All stories should be about rationality winning the day. And they say, Daniil Kharms is also about that because blah, 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 and it's really forced sort of explanation that doesn't actually work. Or they say, Daniil Kharms is writing bad stories. I mean, a lot of traditional sort of concepts of stories would call Daniil Kharms stories bad stories, which I disagree wholeheartedly. But the ending of Silver Blaze, and that also implies that the actual solution is really the what makes the story so great. It's a great solution of a mystery. It's a really cleverly structured sort of mystery solution. So spoiler alert for my 1 or 2 or 3 grandchildren watching this in how many ever years? 30, 40 years from now, when I'll be long dead. Speaking of the menace of mortality, I'm laughing about it because but so spoiler alert, the ending is that the horse killed the ranch. I'm blanking on what job he has. I swear I've read that story multiple times, but at the moment I'm blanking on what the dead person's actual job is. I don't know why I can't retain specific details about that story. But the guy who takes care of the horse, but it was the curious incident of the dog at the nighttime because the dog didn't bark. So, and who's clever enough to really guess that right at the beginning? It's piled into a bunch of details. The dog didn't bark. The dog didn't bark because the dog knew the person who was taking the horse. And there was no outside murder or anything like that. The guy was trying to inject the horse, and the horse just killed him and ran away. So it was some blunt weapon, and we don't know what the weapon is, and it's hard to tell which part is which. And I make reference to that in The Upholstery Man with the cataract knives, and I make a whole thing about cataracts at the end of the story, just because I like the word cataract. Cataract is a weird word because it means 3 entirely different things. Anyway, but it's a little cataract knife that Watson recognizes who actually uses a cataract knife. That's beside the point. So yeah, that recognizing that it was, the dog didn't bark, that there is no other murderer, that the menace is no longer there. The horse isn't going to kill anybody else. Maybe that would be an interesting part 2. Silver Blaze, the menace of Silver Blaze. That relieves the tension. Part of the tension is that there's this murderer out there present somewhere. The finding out that there is no murderer relieves the tension. But that's not the purpose of the story. That's the end of the story, and a lot of people makes that up. And if that was the only value of the story, it would be rereadable. But it's rereadable because of the character. It's not rereadable because of the uncertainty of the ending. And you can apply that to Agatha Christie does a lot of the same kind of thing, but she just ramps up the complexity in these really fascinating ways. Like one of my favorites is, hey, what's up? My black cat is here once again for the mystery discussion. Okay, sit down. Okay. Be still. But Agatha Christie takes the same sort of thing and ramps it up in some complicated ways. Because Arthur Conan Doyle really establishes the structure, that basic structure, and Agatha Christie takes that and ramps it up exponentially, so that she creates a compelling possibility. And this is what she's expert at. She creates the compelling possibility that everyone is the murderer, which, a lot of Sherlock Holmes stories you'll have that. You'll have, the characters. One of the characters might be a murderer, like Hound of the Baskervilles, that sort of thing. Hound of the Baskervilles is structured that way, for example. Silver Blaze, it's a short story, so it kind of goes quickly through suspects, but Agatha Christie is an expert in making everyone a possible murderer. So much so that it became an Agatha Christie cliche that the least expected person was, of course, the murderer, so people would start to expect that, and so she had to change it up again. So she has a formula, but she's so good at the formula that she still makes these amazing, compelling mysteries, whether or not, based on the components within the formula. So something like ABC Murder is probably that's a Poirot. Miss Marple's my favorite detective because she's complicated and fascinating. I like Poirot, but most of my actual favorite mysteries are the Poirot ones. But ABC Murder is a Poirot mystery. But it's it's a standard sort of serial killer type of murder where the killer is killing people with A names in an A town and B names in a B town and C names in a C town, and it goes up to D. And so Poirot's investigating all these towns, and he has all these survivors, and he has these suspects. But she sets it up, in that particular one, she sets it up to be somebody who's really obvious. Obvious as the murderer. And so I sort of visualize it as the circle within a circle. All of these different elements that fit perfectly with this one character. And it's sort of the actual Agatha Christie formula is usually that it's the least expected character. You pay close attention to the least expected character. In that one, she ramps up the evidence so heavily on the obvious character that you're sort of fighting with yourself and saying, it can't be the super obvious character. That's not Agatha Christie's formula. Hold on. There you go. Usually what she does is she'll have a little bit of evidence for one character and a little bit of evidence for another character. You agree? You like Agatha Christie stories? You like Agatha Christie stories? She'll have a little bit of evidence for one character, a little bit of evidence for another character, and they won't sort of mesh together. ABC, she ramps up the evidence for one character. Don't fall off. She ramps up the evidence for one character just so heavily that she's almost relying on the audience to be so familiar with the Agatha Christie formula of never being the obvious character, but then it's so much evidence for the really obvious character that it's hard to dismiss him as the suspect. And he even confesses, and all this sort of stuff that it's sort of a push and pull between it can't be the really obvious guy, it has to be the really obvious guy, that then she pulls the rug out, and of course, and it's somebody else. Spoiler alert. But yeah, I mean, she's is an expert at structuring these things to such a degree that it could be anyone present, and that's and most of the characters are present. And a lot of times it takes place in a house or on a vacation, or like Murder on the Orient Express, Death on the Nile. I'm writing a riff on Death on the Nile now, but characters stuck in a spot. It could be any one of those. Any person that seems very mannerly and seems very nice and seems like they wouldn't be a murderer. Any one of those people could be a murderer. And then there were none. They all seemed like they could be murderers, and they're murdering each other, or what have you. But it's still, it's a very complicated structure. Daniil Kharms is doing a very simple, absurd structure, or non-structure, depending on, excuse me. And then the screen went dark. Daniil Kharms is doing a simple structure, or a non-structure, if depending on what you want to call it. But relying essentially on the same variety of visceral impact, of the menace of the possibility of death striking at random. Death can come from anywhere. Manipulating the desire of the reader to resolve that menace, and then essentially pulling the rug out from under you. Never resolving it, so it's still lingering. And so for the core of, your standard Arthur Conan Doyle stories or Agatha Christie stories, that menace is still the same source of stimulation that you have with throughout the story up until the end. And the ending is quite, structurally it's different. Even if you compare an Arthur Conan Doyle story and an Agatha Christie story, there's tons of similarities. But Agatha Christie ramps up the complexity of the structure. So, you can put those three side by side and look how they're doing the same thing, but the complexity of the structure, the rigidity of the structure ramps up, exponentially each one. But the main difference in the actual mystery stories being that the ending resolves the tension. It's not the purpose of the story, it's just a resolution of the tension, whereas Daniil Kharms doesn't resolve the tension. And ultimately, that's just a choice. It's not a necessity. There's no rule that you have to resolve the tension by the end. It's just a structural element. By the time you get to the end, do you resolve the tension or do you let the tension go? And I talked about this a little bit in another brilliant comparison between Jude the Obscure and Horton Hears a Who. In Horton Hears a Who, they resolve the tension and it's a happy ending. This social outcast who nobody ever believes in him and nobody ever believes what he says. They find evidence that he's actually telling the truth, and then by the end that's resolved. And a person's a person, no matter how small, ends up being true. Whatever. Jude the Obscure, he's constantly seeking some sort of acceptance from somebody, from society, from whoever, and he never finds it, and he dies. And so the tension's not really resolved, it's just he had a miserable life and then he just dies. And those are two entirely valid choices, so you can't really make a rule that says you have to resolve the tension, because those are two masterworks of literature. Yes, Horton Hears a Who is a masterwork of literature. And the same thing goes with Daniil Kharms and Arthur Conan Doyle or Agatha Christie. Masterworks of literature. One resolves the tension. Let me make my hands consistent in my pretend examples. Arthur Conan Doyle, Agatha Christie. One side resolves the tension, works just fine, works perfectly, works magnificently. I shouldn't say just fine, but works magnificently. But other stories, it works just fine. Whereas Daniil Kharms that has no interest in resolving tension. That's not even, there's in no way he would ever even consider resolving tension, arguably. But that's irrelevant. What's really relevant is how they stimulate the visceral response to the text by manipulating the audience's response to the menace of death. That's a good way to end it, I guess. They manipulate the menace of death. I feel like I want to resolve the tension. I need a cute animal to say bye. Maggie. Maggie's asleep. Why are you asleep? Where are the animals? Zico. Okay, now you're awake because you're jealous of your brother. Okay. All right. Come here. I don't want to end on a downer. You're knocking my phone down. I will end on comedy. Here you go. Say bye to the audience. Siku, what are you doing? Come here. Say bye to the audience. Of all the time. So you tried constantly to get on my lap yesterday. Now when I want you to get on my lap, somebody get on my lap. Come on. Maggie will do it. Now both of you will do it. Go on. Get him. Okay, say bye. Bye. Bye-bye. Okay. Okay, now, there you go. Are you comfy? Say bye to the audience. Bye. Okay. See you next time.